There comes a moment in every life when silence becomes unbearable, not because the world is too loud, but because the voice within can no longer be ignored. That voice does not speak of who you pretend to be, but of who you are terrified to become. And yet, that fear is not your enemy, it is the doorway to your most powerful self. The shadow is the buried part of the psyche, often misunderstood as merely the dark or immoral aspects of our being. In truth, it contains everything the conscious self has rejected, ignored, or disowned. These can be perceived as weaknesses, vulnerabilities, desires, or instincts that did not fit the acceptable image we crafted for ourselves. But the paradox is that the shadow also contains strength, creativity, vitality, and the wild energy of our true self. What we fear most in ourselves is often not our darkness, but our power concealed beneath the darkness. The shadow acts as the gatekeeper of transformation because it holds the keys to becoming whole. One cannot grow by simply becoming more of what is already accepted. Growth demands confrontation with the unknown within. When people run from the shadow, they remain incomplete, operating through a fragmented and curated version of their personality. They may find temporary peace through external validation or conformity, but the psyche continues to stir restlessly beneath the surface. Dreams, emotional triggers, projections onto others. These are all the ways the shadow attempts to make itself known. Every time we deny our anger, our ambition, our sexuality, our envy, or our intuitive knowledge, we strengthen the shadow and weaken the self. Fear becomes the border between who we are and who we could be. It tells us where we are most divided within. To become the person you are afraid to be means to walk into that fear and understand its origin. The fear is not of becoming evil, but of becoming more than what the ego can handle. The fear is of outgrowing comfort and shedding the skin of false identity. Those who dare to embrace their shadow begin to recover lost parts of themselves. They become more vivid, more grounded, more authentic. The energy previously used to suppress the unwanted traits becomes available for creation, intuition, and power. The person begins to see others more clearly because they are no longer blinded by projections. Integration of the shadow leads to humility and empathy, because one sees the whole human condition within oneself. What you are most afraid of in yourself is often what the world needs most from you. The rage you suppressed might become your voice for justice. The sensitivity you buried might turn into healing presence. The ambition you feared might create a legacy. But none of it can be accessed until the shadow is owned. The road is not without pain. Facing the shadow is a psychological crucifixion, the death of the illusion of purity and the rebirth of the real. But through that descent into fear, a more powerful and whole self emerges. Not the self that conforms, but the self that was always waiting in silence. This is the individual who lives not by masks, but by essence, who is no longer ruled by the need to please or the fear of being seen. This is the one who stands at the threshold of truth, no longer divided, no longer hiding. To become who you are meant to be, a fundamental death must occur, a symbolic death of the image you've spent your life maintaining. The ego, built from the expectations of parents, culture, religion, and early survival instincts, creates a persona to navigate the world. This persona is not false in a deceitful way, but it is incomplete. It is a mask that conceals the vast complexity and depth of the inner self. The difficulty lies in the fact that this mask has become synonymous with one's identity. People cling to their titles, roles, and narratives because they believe that without them they would cease to exist. And in a way, they're right. The death of the false self feels like a real death, because the ego believes it is all there is. That's why the path of individuation feels terrifying. It asks a person to surrender control and walk into the unknown, to allow parts of their current identity to dissolve without yet knowing what will take its place. This process is not abstract philosophy, it is an existential confrontation. It occurs in moments of crisis, breakdown, heartbreak, failure, when the old self can no longer carry the weight of life. When what once gave meaning collapses and no new meaning has emerged yet, the soul is in liminal space. That space is sacred and dangerous. The ego fights to survive in that void, clinging harder to patterns, distractions, and illusion, but the unconscious is already at work, preparing the birth of something greater. Becoming who you are afraid to be means allowing this alchemical process to unfold. It means trusting the deeper intelligence of the psyche, which always seeks wholeness, not comfort. The fear comes because the ego cannot imagine who it would be if it no longer had to be what others expect. The transformation cannot happen through logic or willpower alone. It demands surrender. You cannot think your way into your true self. You must let yourself be remade from the inside out. This remaking often appears through dreams, symbols, sudden intuition, strange emotions, and unexpected inner conflict. The new self emerges, not as a polished ideal, but as a raw truth that has been buried under years of self-neglect, and with it comes power. The kind of power that is not dominance or control, but grounded presence and integrity. But it is only accessible once the old skin has been shed. People want the transformation without the pain, the insight without the sacrifice, the truth without the cost. But the self is not a surface renovation, it is a full internal revolution. The fear of who you could be is really the fear of who you will no longer be allowed to pretend to be. That is the true cost of becoming real. The journey asks everything from you, not because it wants to punish you, but because it wants to make you whole. And wholeness is always waiting just beyond the death of the illusion. Fear arises as a signal at the boundary between the known and the unknown, a psychological threshold where transformation waits in silence. It does not emerge randomly. It is the psyche's way of indicating that something valuable is hidden just beyond our conscious reach. The very things a person fears expressing, vulnerability, intensity, ambition, desire, or truth, are often the things most deeply embedded in the authentic self, but they remain unexpressed because they threaten the stability of the constructed identity. Fear tells the ego, if you cross this line, you may lose control, and the ego, built for safety and approval, hesitates. Yet this hesitation is precisely what marks the edge of growth. Fear does not always mean danger. Psychologically, it often means direction. If a person examines the source of their fear, they will find it rooted in memories of rejection, abandonment, humiliation, or shame, moments when the self tried to emerge and was denied. Over time, the mind forms protective barriers around those wounds, labeling them off-limits. But what is off-limits becomes the unconscious. What is unconscious becomes projected, and what is projected becomes a distorted version of the truth. To become who you are afraid to be is to recognize that fear is not a warning sign to retreat, but an invitation to deepen into the unknown terrain of the self. The fear is not of actual harm, but of being seen without a mask, of stepping into power without permission, of embodying truths that may disrupt comfort or familiarity. Fear of judgment, fear of success, fear of failure, all these are faces of the same inner resistance to expand. The individual does not fear their flaws. they fear their depth. The mind resists what the soul already knows is necessary. The soul longs for freedom, but the ego clings to safety. This tension creates the anxiety that surrounds transformation. But anxiety itself is energy misdirected. It is the result of trying to suppress the rising force of authenticity. When a person feels fear at the thought of expressing something deeply true, it is a signal that this expression is necessary. Avoiding it only fragments the psyche further. The shadow grows heavier, the resentment stronger, the dreams darker. But when fear is faced, not with violence, but with attention, it begins to dissolve. It reveals its content, and often the truth behind the fear is beautiful. The individual finds not shame, but sensitivity, not weakness, but strength, not chaos, but clarity. Fear protected these truths because they were once unsafe to reveal. But time changes, and the self matures. What once needed hiding may now be ready to lead. To become who you are afraid to be is not a reckless leap into delusion, but a conscious return to integrity. It is the courage to follow fear to its origin and extract the part of the self that was buried there. It is a rebellion not against others, but against the smallness imposed by the fear of being real. And it is in this rebellion that the deepest peace is born. Within every human psyche lies a collection of primordial images and energies, known as archetypes. These are not invented by the mind, but are inherited structures of the collective unconscious, and they appear in myths, dreams, symbols, and emotional impulses. Among these archetypes exist the rebel and the creator, forces that awaken when the soul seeks transformation. The rebel is not chaotic by nature. It rises when conformity has stifled authenticity. It resists imposed limitations, challenges social masks, and dares to destroy what is false in order to make space for what is real. The creator, on the other hand, emerges from the ashes of that destruction. It longs to bring forth something new, original, and alive, not just in the outer world, but in the inner world of the psyche. These two archetypes work together. The rebel clears the path. The creator builds the future. To become who you are afraid to be is to awaken both. The fear does not come from the archetypes themselves, but from the threat they pose to the ego's carefully managed world. The ego fears rebellion because it disrupts belonging. It fears creativity because it demands vulnerability. These archetypes often speak through desire to speak up, to take a new path, to destroy an illusion, to create a new identity. But that desire gets suppressed by social conditioning. The child who colored outside the lines was told to obey. The teenager who questioned the rules was labeled defiant. The adult who dreams differently is called irrational. Over time, the inner rebel and creator are pushed into silence, yet they never die. They remain dormant, waiting for the moment when the inner self becomes louder than the outer world. The one you are afraid to become is not a stranger. It is the rebel and the creator stirring within, asking for permission to emerge. These archetypes are not dangerous. They are necessary for evolution. Every great transformation begins with an inner revolt, not against others, but against lies, stagnation, and self-betrayal. The rebel says, "This life is not mine." The creator says, "Let me shape the one that is." But the ego resists, because the old identity feels like safety, even if it is suffocating. That resistance shows up as fear. Fear of what others will say, fear of becoming different, fear of failing, fear of being misunderstood. Yet these fears are based on the assumption that the current life is the only acceptable version of reality. The path to wholeness cannot exclude the parts of you that disrupt comfort. To deny the rebel is to lose courage. To suppress the creator is to lose meaning. The world does not need more people playing roles. It needs individuals who have the courage to be shaped from the inside. To become who you are afraid to be is not to abandon reason or order, but to finally integrate the forces that give your life depth and direction. It is through this inner revolt and sacred creation that one becomes whole. The unconscious is a vast, intelligent realm that often perceives the truth of who we are long before the conscious mind is ready to understand it. It stores not only repressed memories and unresolved emotions, but also the seeds of potential, the blueprint of the self that has yet to unfold. Long before a person knows who they are destined to become, their unconscious has already begun the process of gestation. It sends signals through dreams, symbols, recurring patterns, and internal conflicts. These expressions are not random or meaningless. They are communications from the deeper psyche, urging the conscious self to evolve. Often, a person feels an inexplicable draw toward a certain path, a persistent vision or feeling that doesn't align with their current identity. That tension between what is known and what is emerging creates fear. The fear is not of danger, but of transformation. It is the ego's resistance to a deeper truth trying to surface. The ego prefers clarity, control, and familiarity. It distrusts the mysterious and often dismisses what it cannot categorize. But the unconscious does not speak in logic. It speaks in imagery, emotion, and intuition. When a person suppresses these messages, they do not disappear. Instead, they grow stronger in the background, creating anxiety, depression, restlessness, or even self-sabotage. These symptoms are not flaws. They are signals that something vital is being ignored. Becoming who you are afraid to be means becoming willing to listen to the parts of yourself that you have silenced. The unconscious holds memories not just of pain, but of brilliance. It holds the essence of your nature before it was shaped by society, before it was shamed or trained into submission. To resist the unconscious is to remain in a state of fragmentation. The person becomes split between the role they perform and the truth they sense within. Wholeness requires that these two selves, the ego and the unconscious, come into dialogue. This dialogue does not happen through force, but through receptivity. Paying attention to dreams, symbols, bodily sensations, synchronicities, and intuitive knowing allows the unconscious to reveal what the conscious mind has not yet accepted. The figure you are afraid to become may already appear in your dreams as a stranger, a mentor, or even an enemy. The unconscious tries to prepare you for this transformation. But the fear arises when the conscious mind refuses to integrate what it sees. The process of becoming is not a sudden leap, but a series of inner recognitions. It is the gradual realization that what you fear is often the most honest part of you. The unconscious never loses sight of who you truly are. It merely waits for you to catch up. And when you begin to listen, when you honor the symbols and follow the quiet call of the inner world, you realize the self you feared was never a threat, but a guide. The unconscious does not want to destroy the ego. It wants to expand it. It wants to introduce you to a deeper truth, one that has been waiting beneath the surface all along. The fear of becoming your true self often masks the deeper terror of what that self might require. To be fully authentic means risking everything the ego clings to: approval, safety, certainty. When a person dares to be real, they step outside of what is socially polished and into what is raw, instinctual, and emotionally alive. This kind of self-expression invites discomfort because it exposes the person to judgment, misunderstanding, and even rejection. Yet it also brings the greatest form of liberation, freedom from the inner war between what is felt and what is shown. The person who embraces who they are afraid to be is no longer imprisoned by external validation. They no longer wear a mask to survive, they breathe freely as their entire being. This freedom is not loud or rebellious by nature, it is peaceful, still, and rooted. It is the power that comes from no longer betraying yourself. The cost of this authenticity is high, but the reward is wholeness. The self stops fragmenting, the unconscious stops screaming, and the soul begins to breathe. In risking everything artificial, one gains everything real. The journey is not without pain, but the outcome is the only form of peace that cannot be taken. To become who you are afraid to be is not a reckless act of rebellion, but the most sacred commitment to your own wholeness. It is the integration of your shadow, the death of your false self, and the awakening of the archetypes that have long waited in silence. It is the recognition that fear marks the threshold of transformation, not its end. The unconscious has always known the path, whispering through dreams, pain, and desire, urging you to become more than what you were taught to be. And though the journey is steep, though it demands everything you once called security, it grants you a life that is your own, a life not performed, but lived. In becoming who you are afraid to be, you become who you are always meant to become.